We are enough Pei Zion Amid base, about 8-10 lines from the bottom. The Mishnah was talking about a platform over water with a hole in it and a hanging wall, which you're allowed to draw water from. And Reb Chananah ben Akavia said that it doesn't actually have to have the hanging wall as long as the platform itself has enough material that you can bend it down and create that hanging wall. That would be sufficient. The Gemara is going to bring three things that Reb Chananah permitted. Gimel Dvarim Hitter Reb Chananah ben Akavia la'anshei Tveria. There are three things that Reb Chananah ben Akavia permitted for the people of Tveria. That you're allowed to fill water from a gezustera, from this platform on Shabbos, even though that it doesn't have the hanging wall, as we just said. And that you can put your hot food into, you can put your produce into these husks from beans. And you're allowed to use a towel for drying yourself on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, explains these three things. Mamalin, mayim migzustura. This that it said that Rabbi Chananah ben Akavia permitted to fill water from the platform, b'Shabbos on Shabbos Hadamar. It's what we just said, that he doesn't require that you actually have the vertical wall surrounding the hole that you're drawing the water from. It's sufficient to just have a platform large enough that if you were to bend it down, it would be sufficient as a wall. The time about Mahi, what is this halacha? The time we learned Hishkim lahavi pselis. If on Shabbos, before Shabbos came, he brought in some of the husks, some of the dregs from the field in order to use it to cover his produce. So because he intended to do this before Shabbos, and so therefore, even though that it really is waste, he nevertheless can use it to cover his produce and to insulate his produce and keep it fresh, because from before Shabbos, before Shabbos he brought it. Now these dregs would have dew on it. It would be moist from the water that came on it. And the halacha is that once you have water on your produce is susceptible to tumah. But it has to be that the water was intentionally put there, either by yourself or you wanted it to come there from another source, even if you didn't actually by hand do it there. As we saw, that the wording of the Torah says b'chiyutan, chiyiten kiyutan, which tells us that it has to be with your intent, even if you weren't the one to put it there. So in bishvil sheyesh alav tal, if the reason he wants it to come is because it's still moist from dew, that counts as if he intentionally put the water there and he made it wet, and therefore the produce is susceptible to tumah. But if the reason he brought it in before letting it dry in the field was because it was too busy, and that's why he brought it in, then it doesn't count as make the produce susceptible to tumah, even though it's still moist from the dew, and therefore the produce will get wet. But since he didn't do it because he wants the moisture, or rather he brought it in quickly because he just didn't have time to wait for it to dry, then it doesn't count as intentionally making it wet. Ustam Anshe Tveria, and he ruled that in general, the people of Tveria, since they were busy with work, you can assume they didn't intend to bring it in with the dew on it on account of they wanted the moisture, or rather because they were too busy. And we're on Peiches Amin Aleph, we're on 88a, and the second line. And the third halacha he said is that they could dry themselves with a towel. Mahi, what's that halacha? The time we learned, mistapeg adam ba'aluntis a person who bathed on Shabbos in a way that's permissible to bathe, he can dry himself with a towel, and he can put it in the window to dry. But he cannot give it over to the Aliyaret, which are the people that worked in the bathhouses, who were in charge. And if you hand them the wet towel, because they had to reuse it, there was a concern that they would wring out the moisture or the water from the person who just dried themselves in it, and that would be schita. That would be extracting a liquid from a solid, which would be a prohibition, and therefore you couldn't hand it to them because they were suspect for squeezing it out. Rabbi Shimon says you can even bring the towel back with you if there was a permissible way to carry without an eruv and so on. But the point that he's saying is we're not concerned that you're going to forget and squeeze it yourself. And these are the three halachas that Rav Chananya ben Akavi said. Amar Rabba bar Ravuna lo yishanu ela lamalis. This that it says that a hanging wall is going to be sufficient to draw water from that hole in the platform, from the water below, through that hole up into the house. That's only true for filling water, bringing water in, because that's a necessity. But to pour dirty water out into the stream or river or lake that's beneath it, that's going to be prohibited, because that water is now going to travel outside of the platform area. So if you have a wall around your platform hole, that's the hanging wall, and when you draw the water up, we're going to say that it's coming from within the confines of that wall. But when you pour the water out there, that's going to leave that space. Maskefla Rav Shizvi, so Rav Shizvi challenged, how is it any different than the uka, which is in the next Mishnah, which says that if you have a drain in your front yard, in your chutzner, that you're allowed to pour the water into the uka. So Gemara says, no, there is a distinction. Hani taimi, mahani loy taimi. That the when you pour some water into a drain, those are going to. They didn't have concrete drains that were lined and was meant to bring the water through the pipe, but rather it was basically a hole in the ground, and therefore these would become absorbed and cease before they leave your property, and so and when you pour it, you have all intention for it to be in that pit that you're in, the drainage that you made for it, and that it would become absorbed there, and so you have no intent for it to go outside. But with pouring it into a body of water, you know, and therefore it's considered your intent that the water is going to leave the space that you poured it. Iked Amri, there are those that say that the other way around. Not only can you bring the water in, but you can even pour it down that hole, and that would be permissible. And even though that we know that the water is going to leave the area beneath the hanging walls, and therefore essentially it's leaving. But the reason is because you couldn't care less where it is. For all intents and purposes, you don't mind that the water remain right there in that spot, and so it doesn't make a difference. However, the Mishnah later, which says that if your courtyard is less than 4 amos by 4 amos, 6 by 6 feet, let's say, that you're not allowed to pour the water into your cistern, into your drainage. The reason over there is because it's such a small courtyard, you actually want the water, you want to make sure the water gets out. So there, because otherwise your courtyard's going to get messy and muddy. And that's why over there, you're not allowed to pour it. Amar of Shizvi, Pshita Hainu Uka. Because of course that's the same halacha as Uka. So he says, no, Mao the Tema Hani, Tami Hani Latami, because I may have thought that the water by the pouring it back into a body of water, it's for sure going to flow out. And whereas by your drainage, it may get absorbed right there. Kamashmal, and that's why he said that it's permissible. We also saw the halacha of there are two platforms, one above the other. So you have two porches from two houses. One is higher up than the other, and one made a hole and the other didn't. And the lower one didn't make the hole, so he can participate in drawing the water from that hole, and therefore it invalidates the usage of that platform without an eruv. And they didn't make an eruv. And the Gemara at this point assumes that the lower platform people are using the hole, the drawing hole in the upper platform on their own without permission. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, lo shana b'smucha. This halacha is only if they are actually in height, they're going to be 10 tefachim apart. But in width, they are actually within the confines of each other. But if they are more than ava b'mafleges, what if they farther away, 4 tefachim or more, muteres, Elyona muteres, the upper one is considered independent, and you're allowed to draw water alone from the upper one, and the lower ones are not considered having rights to the lower platform doesn't have rights to the upper platform because they are more than 4 tefachim distance from the end of their porch to the beginning of the upper porch is more than 4 tefachim. And the reasoning of Rav is, as he said elsewhere, because the only way for the people from the lower porch to get their bucket up onto the upper porch and down into the water to draw through the drawing hole is only by them first passing the bucket over the airspace, the 4 tefachim space, which counts as a valid space, 4 tefachim space over the air. And since the only way for their usage of the upper porch is only through airspace, Rav doesn't consider airspace a valid usage, and therefore they're not considered partners in the drawing hole, and therefore they don't have to participate in the eruv, and their non-participation does not invalidate the upper eruv's, the upper porch's use of its own space. Amar Rabbi Barachana, Amar Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yeshaya, Yesh Gezel b'Shabbos. They said in the name of Rabbi Yeshaya that on Shabbos there is theft, and besides for that there is theft, the illegal or the theft use of a ruin that people are using on Shabbos returns, it goes back to the original owner. So the Gemara thinks at this point that what it's saying is that you're allowed to illegally use, well, it wouldn't be illegal, but you're allowed to use without permission someone else's ruin, somebody else's property, since it's close to your place, and during the week you usually use it for storage or for extra space, and so you acquire the rights, as it were, to that space. And on Shabbos, therefore, it would be your space. And they would also say what seemingly is a contradictory statement, that that Shabbos returns it to the owner, meaning that the owner has to participate in the eruv because it returns to him because he is part. It goes back to his rights, and you don't have a right to use it. So that's a contradictory statement. You say that there is theft, meaning you're allowed to use it, and then you say that it belongs to the original owner, and he has to participate in the eruv, and therefore you're not allowed to use it. Hagufa Kasha said the statement itself is a question. You'd say that there is gezel on Shabbos, meaning that Shabbos allows you to use the space that you use during the week, and it becomes considered your space and not a second, not someone else's space, and you don't need an eruv. then you tell me al machor kanya. So you see that you get some rights to the space, and then it says v'chur v'machzil abaylam, and then it says that the ruin goes back to the owner in regards to Shabbos. Shabbos returns it, meaning he has obligations on account of it. So we see that it goes back to the original owner. Al maloy kanya. So you see that the user does not have rights to it. Achikama. This is what it means. Yesh din gezel b'Shabbos. And what it means to say is that there is a theft. You have to return it on account of that you stole it, meaning you have obligations to the owner, even though that you use it on Shabbos. Ketzad. How is there a law of theft? The machzil abaylam, the churva machzil abaylam, that the obligations of Shabbos make the owner responsible for the place and participating in the Eruv, and therefore it goes back to the owner and it becomes his space, and you don't have a right to use it, and that's what it means that Shabbos returns it. So Rabbah said, so that's a contradiction to our space. Amar Rabbah misvinu mashmaitin. Well, what about our halacha? Because it says because by us it says that the lower people have rights to the upper porch drawing hole. Now, the Gemara, as I said, assumes that they didn't actually participate in the ownership; they just using it. If you say that there's a prohibition of misuse, even though during the week you're using someone else's space, but on Shabbos you don't have a right to use it, and it goes back to the other person, meaning the obligations of Shabbos make it that you're not allowed to use it. Amaya suras. So why is the upper porch not require an eruv with the people from the lower porch, and otherwise they're not allowed to use it? The other people have no rights here. Amar Rav Sheshes, Rav Sheshes says, no, that's not, your assumption is wrong. We're not talking about where they're using the upper porch's drawing hole without permission. They built this drawing hole together. So each one had a porch. And it was expensive to make a hole in the porch and then build this hanging wall around it. So they decided to join in together. And the people from the lower porch and the people from the upper porch said, "Look, we're going to make a drawing hole, and you can use it, and we can use it, and we'll chip in." So then the Gemara says, so if they participated together, why did the Mishnah have to pick a scenario where the people of the upper porch made a hole, but the lower porch does not have a hole? Even if the lower porch had subsequently made its own hole, but they are partners in the upper hole and said it's theirs. The Gemara says, no. Once they make their own hole for drawing, they have made it clear that they no longer intend to throw a bucket up onto the upper porch through the hole and draw water that way. They've now shown that they want to use their own, and they've removed themselves, at least as regards to Shabbos, relinquished their usage rights from the upper porch's drawing hole because they have their own, and they no longer have to participate in an Eruv. They showed their intent clearly. It's not easy for me to use your porch. We no longer intend to use it. So as we saw, the next Mishnah is going to be talking about pouring water. You have wastewater and you want to pour it out into a drainage, that you're allowed to pour it on Shabbos depending on the size of your courtyard. So if it is less than 4 amos, you may not pour water in there on Shabbos. And the Gemara is going to have multiple interpretations, but 2 interpretations as to the reasoning of our Mishnah of 4 tefachim and the differences in halacha. So if it's less than 4 amos, let's say it's less than 6 by 6, you can't pour water in there on Shabbos. Unless you have a drain that can hold 2 seah from the hole and onward, whether it's still in the inside or outside, whether it's in your courtyard or it's outside in the public area. Ella, however, if you have it outside in the public area, Tzarech likmer, then you would have to cover it with twigs and grate to create like a grate over it. Yeah. Mebifnim ain't tzarech likmer, but if it's on the inside of your porch of your courtyard, you do not require to have that cover. Rabbi Eliezer Yaakov says that if you have a biv shu kamur, if you have a drain that is actually covered, arba amos b'shus harabim, as long as it's covered 4 amos in the public area, then you're allowed to pour water in there on Shabbos. So if your drain is simply a hole in the ground that can contain 2 seah, and it's in your courtyard, that's going to be sufficient. If it goes outside, then it would have to be covered. And as long as it has a cover of 4 amos out in the public area, that's going to be sufficient. However, the Chachamim say that even if it's coming from your roof, you're not allowed to pour it down there on the roof, even if it's 100 amma away. That's like 150 feet away. You can't pour it al pi habiv. You can't pour it directly into the hole. Or rather, but you can pour it onto the roof, and then it'll secondarily go into the drain. That's going to be sufficient. That's going to be permissible. And then the water will run on its own. In other words, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can pour it directly into the hole. The Chachamim say that no, you can't pour it directly into the hole. You have to pour it. It has to go secondarily into the hole. You have to pour it onto your roof, and then let it run through the spout into the drain, or you pour it onto the ground and let it run into the drain. The next halacha says that it doesn't have to be just the courtyard, the front, but even your patio under your gazebo are also going to count as your 4 amos by 4 amos, which we said is the minimum in order to be able to pour your water out. And similarly, if you had 2 porches against each other, and coming into a courtyard that's 4 by 4, as well, even if one porch made a drainage for itself and the other didn't, as the one that made the uka got allowed to be poured it down there. But the ones that did not make the drainage are not allowed to pour it because it's going to run out into the street, and they want it to because they don't want it in the courtyard, and that's going to be prohibited. So the Gemara is going to say, what's the reason that we need? What's the reason that we need this 4 tefachim, 4 amos by 4 amos in your courtyard? So my time. Because people use 2 seah of water typically on a day, and that's what they're going to need to dump. And so you have to have drainage that can contain 2 seah. However, if your courtyard is at least 4 amos by 4 amos, so then you wouldn't just toss it out. You actually are going to sprinkle it to keep the dust down. And this is something that they would do typically. They didn't have paved floors in the house or the courtyard, and so it would get dusty. And so they would sprinkle water in order to contain the dust. And so your wastewater was great for that. In the courtyard, you wouldn't just pour it out. You would sprinkle it around in order to keep the dust down. However, but if your courtyard is less than 4 amos by 4 amos, then you're going to pour it because you don't have enough space to use all that water for keeping the dust down. And so you're going to end up pouring some out, and you don't want it to remain in the courtyard because then it's going to mess it up. So therefore, if you've made a drainage area, that can contain the 2 seah, that's going to be sufficient. Eloi aser, but if not, it's going to be prohibited. We're now on Peches Amud Beis 88b. Rabbi Zera Amar. However, Rabbi Zera said the reason is something else. Dalet Amos Taimi. When the reason is not because you have usage for the water in 4 by 4 amos, but rather in 4 amos, once you pour it, it's going to run out. It won't run out because you pour it and it'll just get absorbed on the ground in your courtyard, because your courtyard is large enough to have the water just disperse within it. But if it's less than 4 amos, it won't end within your courtyard. It's by default, it's going to run into the public domain, and therefore you're not allowed to pour it out in there. So Gemara says, what's the distinction between these 2 reasons? If it's rectangular, it still has your 4 by 4, your 16 amos, but it instead of it being 4 by 4, it is narrow and long. It's rectangular instead of square. And so if the reason is because you're going to you haven't have enough space to sprinkle the water down and to absorb this, the keep the dust down. So Rabbi Zera is going to say this is not sufficient because the water is going to run out, but you have enough space, area for sprinkling the water and keeping the dust down, right? So that's the distinction between the 2. So Tanan, we're going to try and prove it from our scenario, our Mishnah's second part, which says that the courtyard and the courtyard and the courtyard and the achsadra, the gazebo, will combine to for your 4 by 4. And the Gemara at first thinks that these don't have to be lined up. A gazebo would be off to the side. And nevertheless, if you had 2 by 4 front courtyard and a 2 by 4 gazebo, they would combine to 8. So, Tanan Chatzav Achsadra V'Sarfin L'Dalat Amos. Now, Bishlam and Rabbi Zera, according to Rabbi Zera Nicha, that makes sense because you still, when you pour it out, it won't run into the public way. It'll run in. It'll still have area to run in your gazebo, from your courtyard to the gazebo. Ela Rabba, but according to Rabba, kasha, that's going to be a question because the courtyard's off, the gazebo's off to the side, so you're not going to use the water to sprinkle the dust and keep it down. So Rabbi Zera responded on behalf of Rabba, the one who he disagreed with, but for the sake of truth, he was responding on his behalf and said, no, you're assuming that the gazebo is off, but that's not the case at all. We're talking about that the courtyard and the gazebo and the covered area are lined up right in front of the house. That the achsadra is in front of the chatzar, and they're both 2 by 4, and it ends up being 4 by 4. Tashema. So we're going to try and prove it from this halacha. Chatzar she'ein badalad amas al dalad amas ein sheftel techamayim b'shabbos. If it's less than 4 by 4, you're not allowed to pour water in there. Now, what's the reason? Bishlam el Rabba nicha. So according to Rabba, that the reason was because you don't have space for it to run out. You don't have enough space to keep the dust down. So it makes sense. It's not 4 by 4. El Rabbi Zera kasha, but according to Rabbi Zera, it's a question because the assumption of the brisa is that it has to be square 4 by 4, and it can't be 2 by 8. Why not? After all, the whole point is that there's enough for it to run out, and so if it's long, it also won't run into the public space. The This is the opinion of the Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan they indeed say the reason is because that's enough space for to keep the dust down, and the water will get absorbed there. But the I don't follow that opinion. I follow the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who has a different interpretation. This is the Rabbanan Umaslitin, and our Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that there's enough. He says the reason is enough. There's not enough space for the water to get absorbed in the courtyard, and it's going to run out into the street, like it says in our Mishnah. That even if it's 100 amas long, you can't pour it in there onto the street itself. So you see, his reason is not because you don't have enough space to keep the dust down, but rather it's because it's going to run into the water, into the street. We see that because he said that you can't pour it directly into the drainage pipe, even if it's 100 amma from the street. You nevertheless can't pour it directly in there. So clearly, it's not on account of that you don't have enough space to use the water and intentionally want it to remain in your courtyard, but rather it's because you're pouring it directly into an area that's going to bring it outside. So you see, that's the opinion of the Mishnah, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So Gemara says, why is he feeling the need to explain the beginning of the Mishnah that says 4x4 is the minimum space of the courtyard? According to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, so Rava says the wording of the Mishnah was problematic to Rabbi Zera, and therefore he had to interpret our Mishnah according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. My area, the Tani Chatzar Shepachusel. Why did it say a courtyard that's smaller or less than 4x4? Listen, typically would say a courtyard that doesn't have 4x4. Why does it say less? So must be the reason is because it doesn't have it's smaller in size. Not that it doesn't have 4x4 meaning square, but einba, pachusa. It's less, meaning it's less in the area, and the reason is because the water is going to run out, and even if it is long and wide, long and narrow, it'll also be so. So it must be that this is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and his opinion is that the reason that you're not allowed to pour it out is because it's going to run out of your courtyard, and you don't have enough space. So now the Gemara says, wait, Shema Mina, the Sefer Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, but you just told me that you know the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is not based on keeping the dust down, but rather because it's going to run out of your courtyard into the public area. Because he said even at the end of the Mishnah, he said even if there's 100 amma pipe, you can't drainage area, you can't pour it into there directly because it's going to run out, and that's considered directly you're sending it out into the public area. Wait. But if the end of the Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, that means the beginning of the Mishnah is not Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. But the Sefer Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Reisha Lav Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So Gemara says, no, actually the entire Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Kula Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The entire thing is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. But there's the transition from the beginning to the end is missing. And this is what's meant in the Mishnah. A courtyard that is less than 4 amas, regardless of whether it is square, rectangular, whatever, it doesn't have 4 amas. You're not allowed to pour water in there on Shabbos. But if it has 4 amas, you can pour it. However, this is based on Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, biv hakomun. He says a covered drainage. Dalet amas, as long as it's covered 4 amas in the public area. So therefore, that makes it a separate area. You're allowed to pour it in there on Shabbos. Otherwise, you can't pour it directly into there. It would have to run off from your roof, and you can only pour it onto your roof or onto another area that's going to run into the pipe. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, so Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says if your pipe is covered, then 4 amas in the public area, you can pour it into. Now, Mishnah is not going to be according to the opinion of Hanania. The Tanya Chananya says, "Afila gag me amale yishpach." Chananya takes it one step further, and he says, even if your roof is 100 amas long, you can pour water on the roof, which will eventually lead the water into the pipe, which will lead it into the street. Because your ceiling, your roof, obviously is not made to absorb the water. Rather, it's made to have the water run off, to run off. And so you're essentially directly making it run off into the drainage. Now we have a brisa that says that this is all true in the summer, when your courtyard is already dry and nice and easy to sit in, and so you're going to want to use it for your home usage. So therefore, you can't pour the water there because you clearly want it to run out into the street. But during the rainy season, where your courtyard in any case is already muddy and you're not really using it because it doesn't have good usage, you can pour it once, you can pour it twice, it doesn't make a difference. You don't have to hold back. My time. And what's the reason? Because a person doesn't mind that the water remain in its place. Well, what about in our Mishnah where it says that the water that is pouring out, even though that it's in a drainage pipe of a long pipe of 100 amma, there's enough space for it to remain in there. He doesn't care. He doesn't need it to leave, and yet it says he can't pour it out in there. So what are you telling me? The reason is because he doesn't want it to remain in his space. Well, if it's 100 amma, 150 foot or more drainage pipe, he clearly doesn't mind that it remains in there, and nevertheless, it says you can't pour it in there. Amar lei, so she said to him, "Hasam l'may nechashla." Well, no. In the brisa, what are we concerned about? It's a rainy season. His front area, his courtyard is already muddy. So what are you concerned about? That it's gonna make it more muddy? It's already muddy. He doesn't care about it. And what are you concerned about? That, well, then people are going to see his drainage pipe that is running water out into the street, and people are going to say, look, he's draining water on Shabbos. During the winter, all drains have water running in it. So what? So the people won't say, how come, why is he pouring water in? That's typical for the rainy season. So Rav Nachman says, in the winter, if he has a drainage that he has a drain that can contain 2 seah, he's allowed to pour 2 seah into there. Machzik seah, nesel. If it can only contain a saw, he can pour in 1 saw. That's fine. However, in the summer, it's only if it actually can contain 2 saw, 2 seah. But if it's less than that, if it cannot contain sa'asayim, 2 saw, then you can't use it at all. Then you're allowed to use even up to the 2 saw. But if it can only contain 1 saw, then he can't use it at all. Well, but why? Since he has a drain that can contain at least half the amount that he's supposed to have, let him at least use and drain and pour down at least half, which is 1 saw. No, no, maybe he's going to end up using 2 saw because that's typically what a person uses during a given day. And since in a given day, a person usually uses about 2 saw that he's going to need to pour down there. And his drain can only contain 1. So once he's going to pour more than 1, it's for sure going to overflow and run out into the public area. And that's his intent because it's the summer, so he doesn't want to he doesn't want it to mess up his courtyard. So if you allow him the 1, he's going to end up using the whole thing. So therefore, unless it can actually contain as much as he will need in 1 day, he's not allowed to use it at all. Well, in the winter also, if you let him use one, he's going to end up using two saw, and that's going to run out into the public area. So it says there too. What are you concerned about? What, are you concerned that it's going to ruin his courtyard, so therefore he intentionally wants it to run into the public area? The courtyard's already muddy, and so he's not concerned about that. And what are you concerned about? That people are going to say, look, he's draining water on Shabbos because you see water coming out from his area? It's winter. People have there's water running out all over the place. And therefore, he's even allowed to pour not only sauce asayim, but in the winter he can even pour 2 kur, and it's not going to be a difference, because no matter how much water he pours, he doesn't care that it remains in his area. He doesn't intentionally need it to run out, and people know that water runs out all the time in the winter, and so therefore there's no concern. In the winter, he can pour in as much as he wants into his drain, as long as he has the minimum amount to drain. In the summer, you have to have the two saw space, and then you can fill it with 2 saw maximum. Beyond that, not, because you don't want it in your courtyard, so you're intentionally pouring it to run out in the public area. The Mishnah further said, if you had 2 courtyards facing each other, two porches, 2 courtyards, and one made a drain while the other didn't. Amar Rava, afilu irvu, even if they made an eruv. Amar Abaye, so Abaye said, my time, if they made an eruv, then they should both be allowed to use the drain. So he said, because it's going to be too much water. But we learned in a brisa that it doesn't make a difference whether you made a proper drain or whether you have a broken barrel, shard of clay that can contain water that you can pour it into there, or you have a pool, or you have a boat, whatever it is. Even though it's already full before Shabbos, you're allowed to continue pouring in Shabbos. So as long as you have the requisite amount of space, a pit or a drain that can contain 2 seah, that's going to be sufficient, even if it's already full before Shabbos. So they have the requisite amount, even though the one built it and the other porch didn't, and the other participant in the courtyard didn't build it. But and even though that the one may fill it, the other one should still be allowed to use it. So rather, what's Rava's statement? It's like this. Rava said, and now we're on Peitas Amud Aleph. Loishanu, this is only true ela shalei irvu. If they didn't make an eruv, then they can't both use it. Aval irvu mutar, but if they did, they're allowed to use it. If they didn't make an eruv, why are they not allowed to use it? The reason is we're concerned that he may end up bringing some vessels from the house down into that area of the courtyard to pour it out, and that's going to be since they didn't make an eruv, that's obviously prohibited. With this, we complete the 8th parak of Eruvin. We shall come back to you. Ketz Mishtatvin, Ezes Hashem Yisparach.